So it's a real pleasure to be with all of you today to address, I would say, a worrisome topic, which is about addressing and trying to understand violence in use and how is our understanding, which is not complete, it's not, things have been moving on so rapidly that I do not pretend today to provide you with robust evidence. Rather, what I would like is that pave the way toward a dialogue, a discussion where we can try to see how to, from different perspectives, understand what's going on for youth, and how does that guide our understanding. So let's go. I would first come back very rapidly, not paying justice to the field, to the rapid social transformation that we're undergoing and their link to youth violence. So what can we say in terms of social polarization and violence? So youth are a product and a mirror of our society. And moving then to who are the youth who are at risk? What can we say about clinical intervention? Something Tracy asked me to touch on specifically. And what are some of the challenges and perspective in the field? And I hope we have discussion after. So I have no commercial conflict of interest related to their presentation. Of course, I have multiple bias, but I would suggest that we all have, and that science also, it's a way to reflect and try to introduce some rigor into our vision, is not bias-free. And then that's why discussion among ourselves is so important. Maybe as a background, so people talk a lot about a perfect storm, and in which is a bit the ground in which a youth polarization and violence will emerge, linked to globalization. So historically, and the last time was 1930, economic hardship, uncertainty can lead to social polarization and has led to social polarization and populism, of course, with very dramatic consequences. Now, what is different this time? This time, globalization has reached level it didn't before, and it's shattering this socially structuring narrative around youth, around which youth would construct their identity. So nation-wise, ethnic, religious, and gender-related. And for developing adolescent, this has special consequences because it's an identity formation period, and a plurality of gender, religious, ethnic, and national narrative is enriching. Now, if the plurality is too much, it can lead to identity confusion, which is linked to violence. So you see the whole idea, identity plurality is a richness. Identity confusion is a risk for violence. And we're at, I would say, in the nexus where it's not evident which side we are situated. Another change is that the internet and the social media are transforming human communication in very rapid ways, which has a direct impact, and I won't touch on that, but it's a whole other research field on youth socialization and mentalization processes. So we're producing human beings which are not what we were, but still our training approaches, clinical approaches, pedagogical approaches are still adapted to the type of socialization and mentalization we had when we were young. They're changing very slowly, I would say. And the virtual sphere is really acting like an accelerator to the propagation of hate and the glorification of this topic, violence. So in a nutshell, a lot of uncertainty, a lot of confusion, and an increase in economic inequality, which creates distress, despair, and rage. Think at the whole literature of death by despair, touching the United States, showing how in white middle-aged groups of men, there is an overmorbidity and overmortality linked directly to poverty. So all of these have an impact on youth. What do we see then? And this is a Canada-wide study from 2003 to 2024. The lines are the trivialization of violence. So is it okay to use violence because it's just good for you? You feel good if you use violence. And what you could see is that a very important number of youth, now 36%, we're talking of the 18 to 34, consider that violence is not so serious. You may use violence if you feel good about it. And that's a new phenomenon. So an enormous increase in 20 years. How does that translate in high school? Because I would say even 5 or 10 years ago, I would have said, and our epidemiological data in Quebec and in the whole of Canada was showing that the peak for support to violent radicalization in 2016 was 19-year-old. 2 years after, it had dropped to 17 years old. Now we considered with our high school data, that's probably between 13 and 14-year-olds. So a very, very rapid shift in peak age of legitimation of violence in less than 10 years. So now in Quebec high school, and that's my colleague Diana Miconi has a lot of data in our high school, 25% of youth glorify the use of violence per se, meaning, bombs and guns are cool. Some ideologies are on the rise, especially masculinism, which we can find in 1 in 5, 1 in 3, depending on studies that we have. Trans and homophobia are on the deep rise also. Racism and xenophobia is on the rise. And all of these is simultaneous. And of course, the appeal to Nazi ideology, Hitler as a figure, and the extreme rights. So what is important is that before masculinism was, or trans and homophobia were and are still interpreted in terms of gender-related violence and often treated as a silo. Now, what is important is that all these ideologies and the violence glorification are on the rise simultaneously and are interrelated with very similar drivers. And I think this is important in terms of solution because we have to think of all these phenomena as interrelated. What do we mean by nihilistic violence? It's really, and it has philosophically always existed in the world since very ancient time. Now, this is strikingly in the rise and very attractive to young people. And it's really the idea that the world is evil, immoral, and meaningless. It means violence is something to be consumed and becomes a source of pleasure. So you thrive on violence, you consume violence. But related to that, you have the attraction and identification to serial and mass killers, school shooters, but also to any form of gore violence. And you have a lot of youth now who consume images of Nazi Germany, white supremacist, ISIS decapitation videos, and so on and so forth. And it's not ideological. What they consume is extreme violence. And the glorification of violence per se means violence here, because you can have glorification of violence, of course, in armies, in political government, and in some ideologies. But glorification of violence per se is not a mean to attain social political goals, even if it can be attached to individual grievances, feelings of rejection, and exclusion. So think of archetypical figures like the Joker, for example, which is an example of meaninglessness violence. You just revolt because of individual grievances and social rejection. Different from Luigi Mangione, who's also an icon, but more ideological of how can we fight and resist social injustices. Linked to that is what we call nihilism and the Generation Z or Alpha. Where the main narratives here is that the social media fuel feelings of absurdity and despair, as I just said. The idea that evil prevails, which is reinforced by what's going on in the world now. The fact that if you're powerful, you may transgress all international law and nobody will say anything. If you're powerful and rich, you may transgress all national laws. You may be a sexual predator, you may be a fraud, you may be whatever, and you still win. So having a moral narrative saying to kids and young people, don't do that, it's not good, and you'll get punished if you do, is not legitimate anymore, because they say, haha, that's not what's happening in the world presently. So this leads to a very disengaged relation with the world, which is present, I would say, in 1/3 of the adolescents. So supporting violence is around 25%, but the disengaged relation is another 30%. And it's also a worrisome phenomenon, partly linked in some extreme to the hikikomori phenomenon. So I close off all my social relation and I really withdraw within my internal and online world. But the disengagement is wider than this small fringe of hikikomori. So in that context, the future is at best uncertain, and young people value a lot apocalyptic scenarios, so end of the world, and it's true in different religious narratives also become very present, and it's the image of what they call the doomer, so something which is a very disengaged and sad picture. Now, in this, I would say, youth culture context, nihilistic group have a lot of power and are increasingly attractive to young people. So I won't go in detail. There are very good material now about produced by security agency about these groups. One example, which is present in Canada, but also in the US, are groups like 764, which recruit youth on social media or video games. You have the whole idea that very often it's youth who recruit youth. Before we had, with weaponization and grooming, the idea that adults, malintentioned adults, could recruit youth. Now, increasingly, you have young adolescents, 14, 15, recruiting other young adolescents, or very young adolescent, up to 11 or 12-year-old, still guiding a murder or an assault on people with weapons, even in another country, in a younger kid, which could be 10 or 11. So these are phenomena that we would not see 5 or 10 years ago, even 5 years, I would say. It's a relatively new phenomenon, which is considered very, very worrisome by instances like Interpol, and of course here, public safety, and in the States, probably the same. These nihilistic group, target preferably vulnerable youth. And here you have a strong interaction with mental health. So, of course, they can generate despair, rage, frustration, but they also target with intent youth who are vulnerable and may be stressed, fragile, and isolated, especially isolated. Autism spectrum disorder kids are targets, suicidal kids, and also eating disorder. Youth are engaged through threats, usually. So if you do not do this or that, we will attack your family, your loved one, yourself. We will disseminate embarrassing photos or whatever. And then when they're compromised in crime, they are invited to upgrade their status by committing more important crimes. So it's really kind of a hierarchy of crime where sadism and cruelty are valued, a lot of torture of animals, sexual abuse of younger siblings, these kind of things. The line between victims and perpetrators is blurred. And this is very important in terms of intervention because very often we tend to say within criminological models, okay, who are the perpetrators and who are the victims? It's not so simple because very often you have kids who have been weaponized, instrumentalized. They are victims, but they're also perpetrators. Now, that's kind of the global picture. Now, what do our research say about, because you can say, oh my God, then youth are becoming violent and this is bad and we're going to do something. Now, beyond that, it's important to read the fact that there is a youth protest which is totally legitimate and will lead to civic engagement, to changing our society, and that's absolutely needed. So the idea is if we merge together the legitimate protest of youth toward what our legacy, which is not great presently, with the legitimation of violence, we risk aggravating the problem. And I think that that's one of the studies we did with Diana, in which we tried to disentangle the support for violent and non-violent radicalization among adolescents. It's really important to do so because there is still, and that's a very good news, a majority of youth who support social change, civic engagement, and are, I would say, stressed and worried by the situation, but not supporting violence. While there is a very strong contingent which do support violence. But if we pack them and saying the desire to change and to move away from the status quo, all of this is linked to violence, or it's, the pyramid model or the staircase model, it's a precursor of violence, then I think we really miss the boat. So legitimating nonviolence, civic engagement, nonviolence, radicalization, say, toward our society is something very important to hear in youth culture. Now, if we shift from there, you say, okay, this youth culture. Youth culture means I think bombs are cool. I think a lot of things that, yes, you could use violence to be heard and exist, or mass killers are cool. These do not mean that youth uttering this or putting it online and so on will in fact commit a mass killing or will in fact construct a bomb. So the relation between attitudes and behavior is non-linear. So that's why I really insist on that. But the pyramid and staircase model, which are prominent in our field, are false. It's a relation, but it's nonlinear. And attitudes should be addressed through primary prevention, which I think a lot of you are involved in, while at-risk use, which is something different, should be reached through secondary and tertiary prevention program with a multi-actor perspective, which I'll talk more about. Okay, so just maybe to sum that, you have a difference between public opinion, representation of authority, and attitudes about violence. And on the right, what are lone actors? And here in lone actors, you have high rates of mental disorder and social isolation, which is not the case in attitudes toward violence at the public opinion and, of course, school level. Now, I think it's very important to distinguish both, because otherwise we pathologize and target all youth in their desire to protest the society that we maintain. I won't enter into that because I want to focus on the clinical perspective, but we can come back to it. So how do we do primary prevention in the education institution, in school and colleges? I think it's certainly not through threat assessment or detection. And I think there's a lot of literature proving that usually, for example, the after Columbine literature, it makes things worse. So again, I'll skip on that one. I hope we can discuss that at another moment. Just maybe name, before we switch to intervention, some of the prevention dilemma. Proximal prevention and targeted prevention, especially through moralization, usually give visibility to radical discourses. So anti-racist, absolutely not against anti-racist education. The thing is, we should ask ourselves, or for example, anti-masculinist education, does it work or not? And I invite you to oppose us, but our constatation presently in Quebec is it doesn't work anymore. Okay, it used to work, it doesn't work anymore. So the idea is, what do we address and how do we address things in order to do primary prevention? Similarly, the evidence about the efficacy of alternative and counter discourse is very slim at best. And so saying, okay, we're going to do counter discourse and alternatives, we will feel very good about it. But again, is it effective? No evidence for the moment. Now, distal prevention, so social equity and changing dialogue practice within institution, making our institution more creative and less controlling, is very difficult. I think that we have, and we're pushing very promising avenues there, but it is difficult because it really requires an in-depth transformation of our social realm. Now, let's move toward secondary and tertiary prevention, remembering the terrible events of Tumbler Ridge in British Columbia this year, so very recent terrible trauma and grief. And I think that in the face of the Tumbler Ridge catastrophe, which was done by a young a woman of 18-year-old, the thing that we should ask ourselves, and it's not an easy question, is could it have been prevented? And of course, you will all say yes, because OpenAI should have reported. Well, I think OpenAI is the usual suspect because it's an external agency to Canada, and it's easy to blame external instances. I'm not saying OpenAI do not have to question their practices. It's a whole other question. But I would say we are all to blame, and I think Tumbler Ridge could have been prevented. Let me just go rapidly. First, at security agency level, well, probably giving weapons back to a family who was this fragile and destabilized was probably not a good idea. At the education level, this youth was out of school since she was 14, and she was in a transition period since she was 12, which means 6 years before. And she was probably in her basement alone in a community in which it's very tempting to say that she could have been bullied. But certainly she was isolated and she was not in school. And this is a problem as we see in our clientele. And in terms of the health services, she has been referred to services multiple times. And her mom was asking for help. And there was no prolonged, coherent system of help put in place. So if we go not in terms of guilt or finger pointing, but in terms of responsibility and ask, could we do better next time? The answer is yes, but we should work all together. We have a model in Quebec, and I'm not telling you that we have all the good answers, but I'm just going to talk about our clientele because I think that we have to learn from our asset, but also what is not working, the obstacles, to go toward prevention and ensure that dramas like the Tumblr region, like so many other drama, will not happen. The model is ecosystemic, intersectoral, interdisciplinary. So what are key treatment principles? We don't try to change narrative. We don't try to de-radicalize people or change their way of thinking. We target their distress. So decreasing the distress and the suffering. We consolidate or foster social integration, affiliation, life skills. We work on the meaning of life, the meaning of their life, enhancing a sense of purpose, providing a voice, agency, and a vision for the future. And these engagements usually happen through these alternative affiliation and the fact of having a voice and feeling heard mostly. We do not challenge cognitive frame. It's a recipe for disaster. Now, where do the kids and young adults, emerging adults that we see come from? That's kind of a recent study done on file review. So you see in red, the religious extremism comes mostly from security forces, the referral. Why? Because they're specialized in that. Since the ISIS phenomenon, they have been hyper alert, and there is some stigma also, and sometimes over-reporting. Now, what is interesting is the nihilistic type of violence come mainly from health. And this is important because it's new. What does it mean is that security agencies are totally missing them, in part because they are youth, and otherwise the other here are mainly schools. So you see, school and the health system is picking up these kids who are nihilistic and who are very vulnerable. Okay, so this is the same. Now, in terms of types of violence ideation, and you see the orange are the minors, the adolescents. The blue are young adults, majority, some adults, but majority young adults. So nihilistic violence is much more common in adolescent than in young adults. You find it in young adults, and this is a growing phenomenon. Since the moment where we produce this data, this is even more marked. Ideologically motivated violence is still important and a bit more important in under 18, but you could see that the most important ideology in adolescent is far right. Religious is present, but not much less important, and even gender. Gender is more important in young adults because the frustration linked to problems in dating, being alone, not finding love are more important in young adults. Now, this is likely to change. We can see it change. For the moment, it's really the far-right ideology who prevails, but much less than the nihilistic violence, which is the single type of violence which was more important in adolescence. Now, in terms of diagnostic profile, the kids and young adults who are referred to as are not doing well. Again, orange are the adolescent minors. And in this group, stress-related disorder, so that includes complex PTSD, but also adjustment disorder, meaning that if you fail at school, if you have your heart broken by a love affair or conflict at home and so on, you may have an adjustment disorder. This is linked both, we know, to suicide, but also to homicidal wishes and violence. It's a good and bad news. Bad news because life hurts for a lot of kids. Good news because if you intervene, they do well. And I think that stress-related disorder do respond to intervention and to care and get worse when kids are isolated. Now, ASD, autistic spectrum disorder, are also very important. And I think that this is something to be noted because it is a clientele which is very easily weaponized online, both attacked, bullied, harassed, and manipulated because they can be influenced easily. So that per se is another topic. Now, in terms of grievances, again, think of the orange as the minors, as you could have expected. And as you know, school grievances are at the forefront, almost equal to family grievances, and then bullying is also quite important. So nothing new. It's the usual suspect, the usual things which hurt kids, which are on the forefront and are drivers of both the nihilistic violence and the ideologically related motivated violence. Now, what happens when we intervene? It's very important to see that intervention is long, and you need to be very patient to see any changes. A lot of people are looking for a quick fix. What can we do in a couple of months to fix the problem? And what our data says is, and these are trajectory analysis over 4 years, is in the first 6 months, things do not move. Rather, things are chronic. It means you have the impression that you are doing better, that your intervention is working, and then you have serious relapse. And relapse are very frequent, up to 1 year, and suddenly they become less and less frequent, and you could see that the positive outcomes are catching up. So in a nutshell, if you intervene, you need to intervene with the school, with the family, with all the youth network for a long time, meaning a couple of years, and then the outcome is good. So it's worth it. But the question is, do we have the resources to do that? And are, in this case, provincial governments and federal ready to say the way to avoid Tumbler Ridge catastrophe is to support the youth who are really at risk for a long time. So does it work? Yes. But are we ready to do it as a society? Not evident yet. So is clinical intervention just good? Because what I'm telling you is that it works in the majority of cases. It's very long, it's costly, and what we have to think is to which level, just like prevention, is it a double-edged sword? There is, and I would say again, historically, it's being well demonstrated, and I won't go back to Foucault and others, there is, or to what was happening in Soviet Union, there is a risk, and we're doing that to a certain extent, of pathologizing dissent, or saying if you don't think like the school, your parents, the society, then you're crazy and you need mental health support. And that's a real problem. There is a risk also of individualizing social suffering in these youth, which send them the message is you're the problem and you should uh, you should, it's about regulating your own emotions. We'll tell you about what diagnosis you have. And it's very interesting how you revendicate diagnosis now, because it's really sending them the message, you're the problem and you're the society, rather than saying you're in a strange society which you could question because it's really not fair and things are not going so well. Doesn't mean it's all crap, but it's really not going well. So now there is also, again, in terms of risk of clinical intervention, the burden of double stigma. Are you you were being socially excluded, you were isolated, you were bullied, you're suffering in school, you feel you have no place there, you feel you have no place in your family, your voice is not heard, which our patients tell us repeatedly. And on top of that, as a clinician, we're telling you you're crazy, and that makes things worse. So that's all the problem you can have with clinical intervention. On the other hand, we've been discussing that a lot with youth judges. Coercion, rules, and values do not heal despair and distress. And I think that one of our main messages now is punishing despair is utterly dangerous. So we're not saying justice shouldn't be made, but justice is not healing despair and rage. If you do not address that, you just fuel it, delay it, and make it more dangerous. It's a time bomb. It will not solve the problem. And risk perception, so trying to detect risk and isolate it or exclude, which school have a whole tendency to do, suspending or expelling youth who they feel are dangerous, who are perceived as a dangerous, elicit rejection and increase social isolation. So again, here we're increasing the risk. So the whole idea is if we isolate, if we detect, if we punish, all of that increases the risk and increases what's going on presently. So we have to look for a way out, even if what clinical intervention and psychosocial intervention can be helpful, it is not just a good solution. A few implications, and after we'll move to discussing with you at the research level, we tend to say we will inspire ourselves, our practice from existing evidence. I have bad news for you for the moment. There is no previous existing evidence who can tell you what to do, who can tell us what to do. They are, of course, in the literature, in multiple fields, in psychology, criminology, psychiatry, education, social work, and so on, anthropology, history, political science, and so on. There are a lot of things and elements who can help us to understand and inspire our action. But there is no evidence-based programs who can tell you, you can apply this tomorrow and this will work against nihilistic violence. This doesn't exist. It's a new problem. It doesn't mean that our past knowledge is not helpful, but it means it's moving so rapidly. We need real-time monitoring of attitudes and youth culture. Things are changing every 5 years. So we cannot say we're going to use what very good studies who were done 20 years ago, it doesn't mean they're not useful. They can inspire us, and humans remain humans. But we have to think that things are changing in an unprecedented way. Now, rigorous evaluation of effectiveness of all prevention and intervention program is needed. But again, not within the frame that it will take us 10 years to have a perfect randomized controlled trial, because otherwise we will know in 10 years what could have been useful today. This is not what we need presently. Primary prevention, we believe as a team, should really invest a systemic perspective and a social justice perspective. We don't have to throw the baby with the water of the bath. So we have to hear youth who are telling us in high school, we don't feel heard, we don't feel it's fair, we don't feel safe. We disagree with what's happening in the world. I think they have a very valid point, and they need to have a voice. If they don't have a voice, the chance of challenging the protest through violence increases. And finally, for secondary and tertiary prevention, we really need to move beyond silos. Think of gender violence, even conjugal violence, interpersonal violence, extremist violence, and mass violence as a continuum. Even gangs now are very much inspired and influenced by what's happening at the level of these nihilistic and ideological trends. So we have to move beyond silo and think all together this issue of the youth violence phenomenon and the younger age groups appearing presently. And we have, of course, at the level of intervention to address the grievances and trauma. Remember the majority of stress-related disorder, support social integration, and support youth in finding a sense of purpose. I'll stop here.